And welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. It's my great pleasure to welcome guest author and good friend and series host, Father Charles P. Connor, author of Faith and Fury, The Rise of Catholicism During the Civil War, proudly published by EWTN Publishing, available through our EWTN religious catalog. EWTNRC.com is the place to find it. Always great to see you, Father.
It's always an honor to be with you, Doug.
It's great to be with you, a historian, a person who works in the church. I love history myself. The Civil War, reading this book was a lot of pleasure I found in doing it. You know, the other day we were walking through the studio and you were sitting there, and it reminded me of the first things that we did working with you, which was the Church and Time spots.
They were a long time back, yes,
right.
Absolutely.
And the thing that
I had brown hair then,
right,
Doug.
I remember, and it amazed me about me too. Amazed me about the fact is you would stand there with a little index card and you'd look at it for like 3 seconds, and then you would sit there and spout this 5-minute talk out perfectly.
Well, when you've lived as long as I have, you remember most of the personalities, you know, so you can just talk.
So have you always loved history?
Oh, sure. Right. Oh, yeah. I think it's always been there in one form or another.
Okay, and you've done multiple almost 20 series, you're thinking, for us now?
I think getting close. Right. I'm coming 23 years.
Right,
here,
and you were on with Father Mitch talking about your latest book, and also the series recently that you've been working on for us as well.
The series was Historic Catholic Baltimore, and now we're in the process of looking perhaps at another locale, another Catholic city.
Right, to keep you busy there.
Keep me busy,
And what are you doing right now? What's your day job?
My day job is Mount St. Mary's Seminary at Emmitsburg, Maryland, and I'm a professor there. I teach both theology and church history.
So as a Pennsylvania Yankee, how does that work for you down in that area of the country, which I would think was pretty southernly sympathetic during the war, right?
Yes, indeed. It certainly was a state of very, very divided allegiances. And I do a few pages here in the book specifically centering on our own seminary at Emmitsburg and how pro-Confederate the faculty were and the students were. And as we were talking earlier, I had mentioned that so many of our students in those days came from Louisiana, which was so heavily Catholic a state, and of course part of the Confederacy, naturally.
Well, the point you make later in the book too is I thought was interesting about the Irish coming over. You know, you talk first about the Ulster Irish coming over, the Anglo who tended to be Protestant, obviously.
That's right. Yeah.
But you make the point that even in the South, a lot of the reasons they became Protestant was there was no Catholic clergy or support for the Catholics, or they intermarried, etc.
That's very true. Many who went to the South were lost to the faith because of the shortage of priests down there, depending on how early you came to the South. And yet, you know, you go back to the 1820s, the late 1820s, and you have the formation then of the Diocese of Charleston, South Carolina, with Bishop England. So there were substantial Catholics in both Carolinas and in Georgia to bring about the creation of a diocese.
Which would be surprising to us today, because we think of those as almost being new areas of growth.
Areas of growth. Oh, sure, but in those days we were an absolute minority, no question of that.
Now you talk about, in the beginning of the book, I'm like, well, where's 1861 here? But you've got all this stuff ahead of time. You got to read about first. Prologue to the coming of the war, 1828 to 1848. And you mentioned that historians generally date the American Civil War era for the most tangible signs of the crisis starting in 1848. So let me ask, what happened in 1848?
Well, for that 12-year period that has its beginnings, then, you really find the very, very decided rise in what we would call sectionalism, the things that were really going to divide the country. And what was dividing the country was really a very different way of looking at the United States Constitution. For example, people think just off the top of their head that the Civil War was fought on the issue of slavery. No, slavery was the particular that brought about. What the Civil War was really fought about was a constitutional difference between what we usually refer to as the organic theory versus the compact theory of government. In the North, you know, the organic theory of government prevailed, and that said that that held essentially that 13 individual states came together, and they created a federal government of expressed, enumerated, delegated, and implied powers. The residual powers that were left over were left to the individual states. Now, you know, the southern position we would call the compact theory of government, which would have said 13 individual states, individual sovereignties came together. They created this new nation, and at the time they created this new nation, they gave these powers, but they had the sovereignty to give the power in the first place. And if this federal government quote unquote, misbehaved, did something it should not do, then the inherent sovereignty of the state was such that a state could simply withdraw from this, if not abolish the federal union and all the rest. That's why there was such a thought that, a fear, I guess, that had the Confederacy won the war in 1865, we would have had two nations.
Right.
It could very well have happened.
Right, exactly. There's a book that was called "If the South Won the War."
That's yes,
sure.
Years
and years ago. You said the church had experienced significant growth in her numbers and institutions in the decades. This was set against a background of political and social strife, including virulent anti-Catholicism that found expression in literature, rhetoric, politics, and in several instances, violence. And you need to go to quote American historian Arthur Schlesinger Sr. to declare that anti-Catholicism was the deepest bias in the American people, and even today to say it's one of the few biases that's still approved of.
The older I get, I cannot find anything wrong in Schlesinger's statement.
Right.
You just see it over and over again, But the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, all these decades leading up to the war, I mean, the stump oratory, the literature, the end is, again, as we did, the violence. They were all know-nothings in the 1850s, the Native American Party in the 1840s. They were virulently anti-Catholic,
Right. Now, it's also, this I thought was interesting. I don't know why I never thought about it. I always thought about Baltimore being the primatial see, and you've done a series on Baltimore. But I didn't think of it in terms of, by doing that there was only one see at the time, and it was all Baltimore. And then it got divided up into New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and of all places, Bardstown, Kentucky.
In 1808.
How did Bardstown, Kentucky slip in there?
Well, I think, in that early period, it looked as though, particularly with tremendous migration of Catholics from southern Maryland into Kentucky. That's a story in itself. In fact, there's quite a large organization.
Working on another series there.
Another series just on that. But there's an organization today of the descendants of these people that get together every year. Hundreds and hundreds of southern Maryland Catholics migrated further to the frontier for greater opportunity, in farming and rural life and the practice of their faith. Well, because of that, it seemed to appear that Bardstown was going to start growing and swelling in numbers. That did not happen, and eventually, of course, it was incorporated into the Archdiocese of Louisville, Kentucky. But Bardstown to this day still remains a titular see.
Really?
And it's assigned to a particular bishop. I don't know who the titular bishop of Bardstown is.
And people hear that titular. What does that mean?
It just means that is a man's diocese in name only.
Right.
For example, every time a man would be made an auxiliary bishop of a diocese, he's got a titular see.
And a lot of those are old dioceses from North Africa
defunct
that haven't
existed. Archbishop Fulton Sheen was the titular Archbishop of Newport. It was a defunct see in Wales.
Oh, really?
But nonetheless, that was his title.
No wonder he had such a great speaking voice.
There you go.
Now, you also talked about the independence and the church's experience in the early days in the United States, and you talk about something called lay trusteeism.
Yes.
What was that?
Lay trusteeism was a major, major problem. It involved the creation in many, many parishes, notably places like Philadelphia and New York City and Norfolk and Charleston and Buffalo, New York. I'm just thinking of the areas where conflicts began to develop. There was the creation of lay boards to run parishes, to take over the temporal affairs of the church. But the idea came from American Protestantism. This is the way the Protestant churches were structured, and the elders, or whatever they were referred to in these denominations, could hire and fire the minister. If the minister got up and said something that people did not approve of, out went the minister, and all this kind of thing. The Catholic experience borrowed from that already existing Protestant experience, and of course...
and is that because this was a new territory, so the church wasn't established?
Sure, and an attempt to assimilate more and more into the American culture in which the church found herself. And these fellows got very much out of control. And lay trusteeism is a real chapter in itself, and there have been all kinds of books just written on lay trusteeism. And finally, it was Pope Pius VII really had to clamp down. Non sine magno was his exhortation, not without greatness. And these papal letters always start the same. You know, they begin by praising the church, but then they start with but,
Right.
and so forth. And he saw the errors, and he wrote a private letter following Non sine magno to the Archbishop of Baltimore, who, you know, as head of the premier see in this country, was kind of thought to be the de facto leader of the hierarchy. And Pius VII said that, you know, the wrong kind of power is to be taken away from these lay trustees, that it is the pastor of the parish, not lay people, not laymen it would have been in those days, but they had so overextended what they felt to be their rights and privileges and power and all that kind of thing, that as I say, became a very, very turbulent period.
Now, Orestes Bronson, I want you to explain who he is. He's an astute, if not uncontroversial observer, had difficulty believing that the Know Nothing movement was of native origin. That's interesting, because you talk about that dichotomy. Rather, he argued it was a source of Irish Orangeman, German radicalism, French socialism, and Italian astuteness, and even this relationship to coming over from England. I think I'm familiar. What is Italian astuteness?
Italian astuteness. Brain power.
Is that what it is?
Sure. And it was trying to size up the situation as the immigrant would find it, I think, when he got to this country and so forth. Bronson had a very active mind. I thought that would be, you know, valid to put in, although I've never heard the Know Nothing movement described in those kind of terms.
Right. Okay.
But he was a very independent thinker. You know, he came through a lot of different religious experiences, and he ultimately became the editor of Bronson's Quarterly Review. And he came out with all kinds of theories, and he was very devout Catholic, but in many ways he was a thorn in the side of many of the bishops of those days as well.
Right, and you talk about later about the growing church and the idea, we talk about Bardstown and the eastern seaboard, but also about settling the West. An immigrant aid convention was held in Buffalo in February 1856, at which an organization was officially established to promote, develop, and carry out a Western venture. And talk about one of the main supporters was from Dubuque, Iowa, a Frenchman.
Yeah, yes, and one of the main opponents, of course, would have been Archbishop Hughes of New York, who was totally opposed to this concept of Western colonization, particularly as far as the Irish were concerned, and he was a native Irishman. But no, it made them too distinct, and they were not going to be able to incorporate themselves sufficiently with their fellow Americans if they were too far off. And he strongly discouraged these kind of things.
Almost like the Mormon Church going to Utah, in a sense like that. You know,
that's right. And there they are in Utah. But they're pretty much just there, you know.
That's to get
same
away.
Kind of an idea, exactly.
Now, Justice Tawney, this is not the highlight of Catholicism in the United States and the Dred Scott decision. Who was he? And he was Catholic, right?
He was indeed. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, about the third or fourth, I guess. What is unique about Tawney, I think, is, first of all, he came from Frederick, Maryland, very devout. His wife was the sister of Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. She's buried in the Protestant cemetery in Frederick. He's buried in St. John's with his mother in the parish cemetery. But he was, you know, if we speak about John Marshall being a judicial nationalist, favoring the power of the federal government all the way, then Tawney comes in and succeeds Marshall, and Tawney would be very much more of the compact theory of government. If it absolutely is not within the prowess of the federal government, then the states may do it. And of course, that kind of rationale helped him, I think, to come up with the judicial conclusion he did in Dred Scott. You know, particularly as regards his definition of citizenship, and not only that, but the fact that purely because Scott had lived in free territory did not make him a free man. Dred Scott, you know, was buried in a Catholic cemetery.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I didn't know that.
Calvary Cemetery in St. Louis. I don't believe he ever became a Catholic, but
I do think it's true. Francis Scott Key was his son who was killed by Daniel Sickles, ultimately.
Yes, that's right.
Sickles salient at Gettysburg, which you talk about in the book was an anti-Catholic location. What made it anti-Catholic?
Oh, I would say that whole locale in Pennsylvania. What made it anti-Catholic was the predominance of Protestantism. Catholics were a very distinct minority. St. Francis Xavier is still the parish church in Gettysburg and served as a Civil War hospital during the war. Catholics really and truly did their part, but they were almost, how would we say it in Gettysburg? They were unwelcomed intruders. But they were unwelcomed intruders many places. So we can't just settle
because not only was the religion alien in a sense, but the people usually came, they were a particular ethnic group, or they didn't speak the language. Or
that's right. That's right. Absolutely, right. Sure.
Now you have a chapter or a section here, Faith Among the Enslaved. So what was the church's approach to dealing with those who were enslaved from a faith perspective?
It's an interesting story, Doug, because really we have a tradition of centuries papal moral condemnation of the institution of slavery by any number of popes, directed at situations all over the world for different reasons. Now, by the time we come to the American Civil War, we were the last vestige in Western society that was still hanging on to this institution of slavery. The problem here was that it had been an accepted social institution for over 250 years by the time the Civil War had begun. And the Catholic Church and its leadership, its bishops in particular, being conservative men, were not going to be out in the front lines of trying to overturn or engage in all kinds of rhetoric for social change that might overturn society and all the rest, as their fellow Americans were not doing it either. The first people who really began to do it were the abolitionists. And the abolitionists in the 20s, 1830, well, they're rather kooky kind of people. They're trying to overturn something that we've had now for 250 years. It's certainly contributed to the economic aggrandizement of the South, to their economy. There's no question about that.
Right, cotton gin.
But in any event, they kept it up, the abolitionists. And as we look at them now, they were talking, their moral objection was, here is an institution that is holding human beings in bondage, and that itself is immoral. Right. The problem with the abolitionists was that they also felt the Catholic Church was an institution which held people in spiritual bondage. The Pope was the dictator. The old Protestant argument, Catholics are told what to believe. Right. Now that to our mind is ludicrous. But Protestants believe
especially
this.
Today.
Oh, sure. Especially today is right. So as a group, the abolitionists were so anti-Catholic that under no circumstance were the Catholic bishops have any inclination to join forces with the abolitionists.
If they did have that inclination.
Even if they did have an inclination.
Now, they wouldn't probably be welcome in the...
That's very true. They morally condemned the slave trade, the buying and selling of human beings, always. They said little about the existing institution, but then loads of people said little about the existing institution. You can't single out the Catholic bishops for criticism here. I think that's very unfair, as opposed to the American society
in general,
mores in general.
Right.
They did strongly stress the moral obligation that slave owners had to make sure that the slaves on their plantation were raised with the fullness of faith, that they had the sacraments, that they had proper moral instruction on how to live, and so on and so forth.
Right.
And finally, I should mention this as well, too, I think. The Second Plenary Council of Baltimore was held in 1866, just 1 year after the war ended. And there were those who felt and who really believed that the council was going to do an awful lot in the area of black evangelization, to take the newly freed slaves and to evangelize them, to bring them into the fullness of Catholic truth. It was Cardinal McCluskey was the first American cardinal. He was in New York. He was one of our graduates, by the way, from Emmitsburg.
Oh, okay.
And he wrote a letter to Martin John Spaulding, who was the Archbishop of Baltimore at the time. And he said, talking about black evangelization of the freed slaves, he said, this is a tremendous opportunity, and if it is lost now, it may never come back again. Well, it was lost, and it never came back. And the overwhelming percentage of African Americans today are not of the Catholic faith because we didn't do the work to bring them in.
Right. It was also interesting, you mentioned that Lincoln, because you talk about Tawney and Lincoln, there's a connection there. Lincoln had rather close Catholic ties. As a young congressman, he often visited his Catholic relatives who happened to live within his district.
Yes, Lincoln's father had a brother who married a Catholic. She was of the Mudd family of Southern Maryland. And you remember Roger Mudd used to be on CBS
Yeah, sure.
years ago? Roger Mudd would be a descendant of that same family.
Oh, really? Okay.
Dr. Samuel Mudd,
I was going to say.
yes, who tended to the wounds of John Wilkes Booth,
Right,
and
exactly,
so forth.
right.
Well, this Lincoln married into that Southern Maryland Catholic family, became a Catholic himself, and their children were all raised, and they took a very active part in Lincoln's presidential campaign, his congressional campaigns, and so forth. And one author talking about them said that they also shared, there was a mental strain in the Lincoln family given to depression and melancholia and this kind of thing. Lincoln himself had it to a great degree. And
I think his wife did too, even though she wasn't related.
Oh, indeed she did. But in any event, these cousins seem to manifest the same emotional.
Now let's talk about the war years, 1861 to 65. Catholic participation in the war effort was substantial on both sides. And you quote, "The 1st Virginia Infantry donned green and gold uniforms and marched to the basement of Richmond St. Peter's Cathedral, where the Bishop John McGill blessed the pikes they carried. At Bull Run, they would confront New York's Irish Catholic 69th Regiment, later known as the Fighting 69th, obviously, from World War I especially.
Sure. Well, those kind of stories, I think, are representative of the fact that really Catholics were as divided, North versus South, as all of their fellow Americans were. And all you have to do there is to read the Hughes-Lynch correspondence that ran in the country's Catholic newspapers, anyway. Archbishop John Hughes of New York versus Bishop Patrick Lynch of Charleston, South Carolina. There you get the organic theory of government versus the compact. And these men spell it out. And in addition, both of them are interesting men. They were both natives of Ireland. They both came to this country and were, worked in dioceses, were made bishops in course. And they both carried out diplomatic relations for their individual parts of the country. Right. Hughes went over to France to try to ensure French neutrality, and in that he was quite successful. Bishop Lynch went to the Vatican to try to obtain official Vatican recognition for the legitimacy, and in that he was not successful.
Right.
So they were well thought of men by their government.
You made a comment about what the perspective, maybe off the record, of the Pope was on his perspective.
Oh yes, Pius IX. Yes, Pius IX was known to favor the Confederate cause in many ways, and he became rather friendly with Jefferson Davis, who of course himself had been educated as a young boy by the Dominicans. In Springfield, Kentucky, at St. Rose School there. But yes, a friendship did develop, certainly, and
it's interesting, like you say, Hughes kind of was sent over there to kind of, the idea was, let's keep Europe out of this.
That's right.
We don't want that, because the South was hoping that Europe would come into the war on their side.
Particularly the British, especially, because there was much in common with them.
Exactly. And then Lynch was sent, well, wait a second, we got to get our own entourage over there and do our own lobbying.
Pius IX seemed to have the idea that the South was much riper for conversion than the North was, and he had been given statistics that there were many, many more converts that had come into the faith in the South.
That there actually probably were.
More than there were.
Well, here's a couple of just quick ones. Colonel Kit Carson, famous. He was Catholic.
Yes, or a convert, I believe.
Yeah, I was surprised about that. And General Beauregard, of course, he was Catholic, but he was a Freemason. How was he working that out?
Well, like I suppose a lot of others, so they would join for pragmatic purposes, you know. How devout Beauregard was in the practice of faith, I'm not sure.
Right, exactly.
How devout any of them were. I was reading recently about Phil Sheridan. I don't necessarily know how staunch he was.
Right, exactly.
Some people think Sherman was a Catholic. He never was.
He wasn't,
No. His wife, Ellen Ewing Sherman, was a very devout Catholic.
Wasn't Sherman's son
a Jesuit priest?
Right.
Father Thomas Ewing Sherman.
And I think Sherman...
And the old father never cared for that too much.
Right.
That his son had become a priest.
Right. Over 70 Catholic chaplains volunteered in 2 armies, you mentioned, as far as what went on both sides of the war. Now, in the sense of soldiers fighting one another, and you talk about here in Chapter 5, the Irish contribution. You also talk about the fact that, as I recall, you also had the draft riots in New York.
Oh, right? Yes, indeed. Yeah. The Irish. The reason we have a separate chapter there, of course, obviously they were the largest numerical Catholic group at that time. The Germans would be somewhat less German Catholics, but still they were here in very significant numbers as well. But the Irish contribution, of course, we talk about the people at the White House, and we talk about those in politics and the impressions they made at the time. But as far as the Irish themselves, they are more related to the Fighting 69th, I think, than any place else as far as military contribution is concerned. That's one side of it. But then after the Emancipation Proclamation, after the freeing of the slaves, there was a tremendous fear on the part of many of the Irish in New York that the slaves were going to come north and they were going to
take their jobs.
Take their jobs. There'd be competition in the job market. And that is, of course, what the New York City draft riots in the summer of '63 were all about. Well, Lincoln finally ordered a lot of the troops who had just finished fighting in Gettysburg to go up to New York City and to try to restore order in New York City. And these fellas, these boys, were in no mood to listen to any kind of arguments with these Irish who had not fought when they had, and so order was rather quickly restored.
Right, and there had been a practice.
And the Irish do not look good in that draft
where you could buy yourself out of the draft, right?
Oh, yes.
By paying somebody else,
yes,
somebody else to take your place.
You could pay, yeah, that's right. Buy a substitute, sure.
Right. So how long did it take you to put this together?
Oh, at least one school year, I guess. I'm going to start now on the third part of the trilogy, and that will take me all of this school year.
And when do you write?
Oh, you get it in during the day, and it's. The seminary's daily structure is such that you can single out periods of time every day to devote to it. So it gets done eventually.
So what's the one thing you, Mr. Historian, learned in researching this book that maybe you didn't understand or knew before? Oh,
well, I think probably the thing that always strikes me with any of these periods of U.S. Catholic history is that they all prove the truth of what Cardinal John Henry Newman once said about writing history. He said, "No sooner have we finished chanting our Alleluias than we're singing our Misereres." It's the up and down, the ebb and flow, it's the fortunes of the church and then the misfortunes of the church. Well, that theory of Newman, of course, came about more clearly to me over this 50-year period here that we cover, I think, and it just kind of was kind of a mental tour de force as I was going through all this.
So we'll look forward to the next edition. Always great to see you,
Father. Thank you. Always good to be here,
Keep up the wonderful
Doug.
work and making us look good here at EWTN. Father Charles Conner, Faith and Fury, The Rise of Catholicism During the Civil War, proudly published, as I said, by EWTN Publishing, available through our EWTN Religious Catalog. EWTNRC.com is the place, all things Catholic. Check it out. Check us out next time right here on Bookmark. Thanks.